Hello, everyone. This is episode one of Plant Guilds and Fungal Films. I'm joined by my good friend and soil scientist, Scott Goode. Hello,
Mm-hmm.
Scott.
Hi, Dave. How you doing, RJ?
Good,
You go
good.
by RJ, don't you?
RJ, yeah, you
RJ,
can
is
call
that
me
it?
RJ.
Okay, good.
Some call me other names,
Yeah, I
but
know. I just want to be on board.
so Scott is a carbon sequestration
Research.
researcher and also works in land management services.
Yeah.
Uh,
hmm
Yeah, why don't you tell us more about yourself, Scott?
Well, I'm retired from doing environmental sciences, mainly computer modeling of oh, groundwater systems and contaminant transport and that sort of thing. A lot of modeling and a lot of geographic information system development, different layers for everything from environmental impact statements and environmental assessments, that sort of thing. And that was pretty much my professional career. And uh, like I said, it was primarily in environmental evaluation and management and that sort of thing, which was really a fairly difficult career because the place is a huge mess, really. And so fortunately, I've been able to shift my emphasis to my absolute favorite soil species or earth species, and that's carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, people think when they're thinking about carbon, they think about biology pretty much. But from the perspective of a geoscientist, carbon makes up a really, really important part of the balance between the atmosphere and geology. And one of my, uh, when I was still at University of Texas doing graduate work there, I was I worked for the Texas Bureau of Economic Geology, and what I was doing was generating computer mapping, 3D computer mapping with um, one one of the really wonderful computers of the time. The Iris series had when you look at what Google Earth actually used in order to develop Google Earth, it was
Mm-hmm.
the big brother of the machine I got to use. I sort of felt part of that community back in the day. But one of the things that I was looking at was we were looking at first mapping all of the lignite deposits. Now, lignite is the very, very, very first youngest stage of coal development. And when you look at lignites, the difference between a lignite and a compost, if you look at it, there's not that much difference really.
Mm-hmm.
And chemically, there's not that much difference. And so I was modeling where the environments of deposition for these were and what had happened to those environments since the Eocene mainly. Um, and it really began to make me wonder where in this the carbon cycle this flux of carbon to be that was actually hidden and became part of the geology of the planet. You know where that fit into the scheme of the atmosphere and biology and all that. And if you look at a graph of temperature and oxygen and CO2 and all that stuff for the last uh, you know 1.5 billion years, you see consistently over that period of time that carbon dioxide goes from 10 times what it is now, 3,000 parts per million or part per thousand, down to the current 400. Back 8,000 years ago, it got down to, well, it was well below 200. That's why we were in um, um, the zone where Milankovitch cycles would take us into an ice age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The reason that was is because CO2 levels were low enough that we were below what's called the glacial threshold. Once you get CO2 levels, there are other things, water vapor influences, methane influences, and all. But the thing you can really note about carbon dioxide is once we get below about 350, 300 parts per million, then that puts us into a zone where we go into ice ages periodically. Whenever the Milankovitch cycles get us enough far enough outside the Goldilocks zone in our orbit to put us into an ice age. So here, carbon has this key role. It's the basis of life. It controls whether or not we have glaciers or not. All of these interactions. It instigates oxygenated atmospheres by creating plants that ingest the carbon dioxide that then generate the oxygen. Mm-hmm. So that stimulates that. So there's all of these interrelated components of geology and biology and climate and all these that are all centralized around carbon. And that's why it really fascinated me. And so that's what I've been really studying, researching seriously since about 2015, when I had the opportunity to start doing it in a more academic setting. Mm. And then 2017, I got the support of Desert Research Institute to give me access to research topics and stuff like that. And in that time, I was fortunate enough to drop into biochemistry and geochemistry and biogeochemistry at exactly the right point, where the study of coals and how coal formation occurs and that had made it far enough along that it was beginning to bump up against biology. At the same time, when soil biology and soil chemistry both was beginning to really explore what soil organic matter was really all about, where it was composed, and it opened up a huge debate over the last decade or so. Was instigated by the fact that they realized that everything that they believed about soil organic matter was a vestige of the way that they tested or removed soil organic matter. So they would come up with all these compounds and say, oh, this is what soil organic matter, and they were completely wrong. Mm-hmm. It was after you boil it in caustic, and then you boil it in acid, and then you take the things that drop out of those boils and then try to say that's what organic. Well, they realized that was completely not true. Mm-hmm. And then they went through a period of time and said, well, there really isn't any actual soil organic matter. We looked and looked and looked and looked, and stuff just breaks down and turns into carbon dioxide through a process called soil priming or rhizospheric priming. Well, the problem was they were only looking in agricultural soils that had been dead for a decade or maybe 100 years. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Dead. Yep. And sure enough, they couldn't find, where organic matter was or where, or anything. And so finally, particularly in Europe, people started actually looking at healthy soils, like, under old growth forests and that stuff, because everybody knew that there was humus, that there was organic matter, and just because the American scientists couldn't find it because their soil was so screwed up that they couldn't find any, mm-hmm. didn't mean it wasn't there. It wasn't there.
Got it.
And so as that moved on, we've now begun to really understand not only how soil organic matter forms, but actually how carbon, or a more complete understanding of how carbon cycles through the soil and geological systems. And that gave rise to understanding that soil biology exists in these spheres, the detritosphere, the drillosphere, and all these layers. But the thing that linked all of those individual spheres and all of the huge variety of biology that was in those spheres was the fact that they were taking complex organic molecules from the detritus of plants, mm-hmm. decomposing them, sifting out the nutrients, feeding them back into the system, and taking the carbon and storing it into the soil. First, as soil organic matter if it was in a soil. But all the places where we accumulate enormous amounts of carbon that we pull out of the atmosphere and put into the geology do not happen in soils. As it turns out, it can't happen in soils, because the reactions that occur between soil minerals and organic molecules is an oxidation process. It carboxylizes any carbon that's in there and turns it into CO2. So where carbon sequestration actually occurs, it has to be away from soil. It has to be away from the atmosphere. And ultimately, for it to turn from peat into coal, it has to be away from water. And if you have carbon that you can sequester into an environment where it finds all of those conditions that naturally exist in a coal swamp, because the water keeps it away from the atmosphere. It's in a swamp. There's no soils. It's like 80% organic matter. And those kind of swamps, they're a specific kind of swamp. Nutrients don't accumulate them. There's so much net primary production that all the nutrients go right back into biology, like they would in a tropical forest. And that's why most of these are in tropical environments, because they can cycle nutrients that fast. And so the only thing that's left is wrung out carbon. They pull all the nutrients out of it and they wring out the carbon. And if you accumulate that, you get miles deep layers of peat. If you cover that, make sure it doesn't go into the atmosphere. If you don't mix it with any soil, and you're able to squeeze all the water out of it, then it'll turn into coal.
All right.
But the original accumulation, and that's a geological process, is where it goes from lignite to coal. But the formation of the lignite initially, the peat and then lignite, that's a biological process. It's a superficial process. And just like any other chemical process, if you understand how it actually works, and there's been enough research, there's hundreds of articles on each one of the little cogs and wheels of how this whole process works, then you can create a zone, just like you do with any chemical reactor. You create all the underpinnings of making the reaction go really, really fast. Well, it turns out that if you set up the right biological conditions, then you can make the process of going from biomass into a form of coal, lignite or leonardite, really similar. Then once you get carbon into that form, the only way that carbon can make it back into the atmosphere is if you burn it. Well, all of the other processes that people talk about pulling organic matter into the soil, all of the humus and even humic acids, if you treat them badly enough, they go away. The Great Plains are a perfect example of that. They had like 6 feet of heavily organic laden soils that they completely eliminated in 50 to 100 years. That's how fast it can go away. But once you get carbon into the form of a lignite or a coal, you can expose it to the atmosphere. You can plow it even. If you look to lignite mines, it's blasting and scraping and trucks and all that stuff, and all the carbon that stays in that, other than what blows away as dust, stays as carbon. And so if you're going to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, you have to do it in such a way that it satisfies. There are 5 components. I was going to.
How about to give some context to all this, would you like to kind of start to explain the research that you're actually doing and what you're actually physically doing and everything?
Well, essentially what I'm doing is I'm figuring out if you can replicate all the processes that happen in one of these coal swamps, and if you can actually integrate that into a cropping system, to where you have a cropping system that accomplishes all of those things. Well, it turns out if you line up all of the spheres correctly, if you actually utilize or dramatically expand the detritus sphere, which is where you cycle nutrients out of biomass and concentrate. And as long as you can supply enough biomass to go into that and keep it going, and you organize the drillosphere, which takes nutrients from the detritus sphere. Worms are underneath detritus. They take that nutrient in, they pull it down into the soil, and they wriggle along with all their companions all the way through the soil, and they spread it out away from the place where it's decomposing, the detritus sphere, and then all their companions start oozing that out. into the soils around it and filling the pores with the nutrients that have been derived out of the biomass. And then this feeding frenzy occurs. Now, almost all the critters that are doing this feeding, particularly fungi and bacteria and protozoa and stuff, they don't have mouths particularly. Well, protozoas do, but most of the guys don't have mouths. What they do is they slime everything with a digestive fluid, enzymes and so forth, and they lick up, literally, they're sponging off everything out there, ingesting what digested, and leaving everything else, including the digestive fluids, all over everything that they were covering. So when you're talking about these fungal films and biofilms in general, they're called extracellular polymeric substances in the literature, EPSs, then eventually the entire soil mass around where this decomposition occurs ends up getting completely covered in a layer of biofilm, of these biofilms. And suddenly when you're looking at your soils, you're not seeing soil anymore. You're seeing a soil particle, which you can no longer see because it's completely covered with humus and these exudates and stuff. And well, once that starts happening, the individual aggregates begin to kind of stick together, and they stick together with a glue that, instead of being like a mineral cement, like you would find in a mineral soil, which dissolves when it gets wet. That's why the mineral cement was there to begin with. It was a mineral that got wet, some of it dissolved, goes into soil solution, dries out, forms a cement, and that's how you get a clod or an aggregate. But if you do that with these biofilms, they still form aggregates. They're just as sticky as the mud or the mineral cements are when they're in solution, and they'll form up into beautiful aggregates. The only difference is they're not water soluble. So that means the next time that aggregate gets wet, all it does is absorb the moisture inside it, and it doesn't fall apart.
That'd be the same thing as like jellification.
Well, jellification, I mean, technically, jellification is the chemical transition of biomass into the first stage of coal.
Okay.
And if you go to the literature and look for jellification, that is the process. And that's because nobody could, well, you didn't have electron microscopes and stuff like that to understand how this process occurred, that you went from this goo, biological goo, peats and, that stuff, into kind of a stickier and stickier form until it got so sticky it was coal. And that's that process. And it was very much a black box idea for a long, long time. So, well, it goes through this weird jellification process, and that ends up being coal. But that technically what jellification is. But when you distribute these organic cements around and aggregate soils with them, that's just building organic matter in soils. And that is, like I said, it's an entirely biological process. And if you interrupt that relationship between where the detritus is decomposing, where those decomposition products are being absorbed into the soil, and then through the soil, it's distributed through all the little pores, and then beyond that, over on each one of the aggregates, there are, the bacteria that are in soils are 10 times smaller than clay particles. So that means that a clay particle, even though you have to have an electron microscope to look at it, if you look at it really closely, you discover there's critters crawling around on it. And so when you have a living, active soil, that's the process that's happening. And all you have to do in order to break that entire system is plow it. You break off all of the quorum sensing relationships that have existed. As individual components of the soil biology begin to grow, there are certain things that those critters can't do until there's enough of them in order to get a critical amount of a given enzyme or chemical or something like that.
Could you explain quorum sensing a little more?
Well, there's this understanding now that there is so much communicating, just like in the body. You have all of these endocrine systems and stuff that are waiting to get enough of a certain hormone in the bloodstream that they kick in and, utilize iodine or something like that. And they're constantly sensing when enough of something is in place in order for this to turn on or turn off, insulin, that sort of thing. Same thing is going on inside the soil in a far more complex way. Because in addition to all that stuff going on inside each individual critter, they're all communicating by giving off pheromones and enzymes and all sorts of other things to each other, how many, there are. And like, for instance, you have pathogens that'll just sit out there and multiply and multiply and multiply very, very quietly. And when they smell, if you will, that there's enough of them, they'll attack our plant. And they won't attack the plant until there are enough of them that they can know they can be successful. This also happens in the gut. And the other thing is that they can't produce enough of the toxin or whatever it is that the pathological or pathogenic part of what they're doing, until they get up to that level. So there's good sides to quorum sensing and bad sides to quorum sensing.
Absolutely.
But it's clear that is how things work, and that it's certainly happening in the soil. And a soil really, really doesn't become completely active and fully going until these populations are sufficient, or it's possible that it needs to go through one entire annual cycle of sporification and whatever in order to get the entire cycle going. So you have Dr. David Johnson, who invented he and his partner designed the Johnson Sioux reactor, which is one of the most effective ways of generating fungally dominant composts and compost teas that there are. And his work is absolutely amazing. And there's lots of good YouTube videos on what he does, and Beam, his biologically active management system, agricultural systems and stuff, beautifully thought out. But what he pointed out was that his compost, the compost that he creates, is not fully functional for 18 months. It takes that long for all the gears to get in place and all the relationships to establish themselves. And if you use the compost before it has fully developed, you're going to be missing something. And if you're distributing it before those levels are up there, it just doesn't completely work. So that's what you have to do, is you have to understand how many of these things, what relationships they have to have in order to, to actually operate.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe an unintentional consequence that a lot of people that are composting don't realize. They may be filling their compost with wood chips and lignaceous material, thinking they're creating a fungally dominant compost, but using it after 2 or 3 months to 6 months.
Well, they end up with a whole lot of white and black fungal decomposition and stuff. And that's the first stage. That is simply disassembling the lignin and the chitin and the suberin and all those things into their constituent components, so that the actual next layer of decomposition, or transformation really, and depending on if that happens in the atmosphere, then one process goes, usually carboxylation, and carbon goes out in the atmosphere, or in facultatively anaerobic conditions, and which in truth, almost all the biology that's happening in the soil, if you think the soil is full of aerobes It's only full of aerobes because you just plowed the soil.
Controversy.
Well, I mean, go look at a healthy soil, many healthy soils, and you'll see the predominance of the critters that are down there are facultative anaerobes because they have to go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And fully, obligate anaerobes are almost always associated with decomposition or pathogenesis of some kind. And everybody's right about like you don't want it to go anaerobic on you. But the truth is, all the critters that are actually doing the work in this process of all these, they're living inside pores inside soils that are well away from the atmosphere, and just the carbon dioxide levels that are there, are so high that they are not in an aerobic environment. Mm-hmm. And so the facultative anaerobes, they jump back and forth. If a plant root comes down or a worm comes down and aerates the soil, then they go in and they do their aerobic thing. Mm-hmm. And incredibly, just as important as their anaerobic thing. And then that gets sealed off and they jump over. And in general, what they're doing in their aerobic phase is decomposing something and turning it into a constituent. Mm-hmm. And then when they flip over, they're handing it off to somebody else. And you have to have both sides of that phase in order to make the whole thing pump through and move through. So
I think that highlights something important to note too. Coming back to maybe using compost that's not completely finished, or at least finished in the way people think, and people are taking that and bringing it right to the rhizosphere.
Yeah, that's where it belongs.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain that a little more? Why that's a bad idea?
Because when you decompose organic material, this is called catagenesis. It's taking something complex. Catagenesis is taking something complex and breaking it down to constituent components, and that's what goes on in decomposition. In the detritus sphere, if you will. Mm-hmm. Well, what happened in the rhizosphere is exactly the opposite of that. It's taking fundamental components and assembling them to ever more complex things and feeding it to a plant, and the plant feeds it back. And so that is. Thermochemically and reaction-wise, those are completely opposite processes. And if you're trying to do both of them in the same place, then it's incredibly inefficient. Just to say that. Okay, so keeping all the decomposers in the decomposing zone where they can then hand that off to something that's designed to take decomposition products, ingest it in, mix it with biology, and decompose some of it out, and then pass that on to the next layer. That's a process that actually works. Mm-hmm. So, in catagenic situations, you're going to take oxygen generally, and nitrogen. And all those things, because the critters have got to get energy in order to do this decomposition stuff. Well, if they're taking up all those nutrients and oxygen in the environment, and a plant root is right next to it, and it's trying to use the same nutrients to do the opposite thing, then what you're going to end up with is have a dearth of carbon and oxygen and all the things that they're actually competing for. So the idea of tilling in a green manure or a compost or something like that directly into the root zone, you're just introducing biological competition, and you're trying to do two opposite chemical processes in the same vessel. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it becomes incredibly inefficient. And, the gross, if you stand back and look, the thing you see is the carbon gets turned into carbon dioxide, and doesn't in the other environment.
Yeah. So, to piggyback on that, would you say, if a gardening or agricultural system that utilized all these spheres in the correct layers, either on top of or adjacent to the to the growing beds
Hmm.
would be even better than even taking a finished compost and then putting that into the soil.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly if you have a system set up to where rather than in en masse taking all the biomass and taking it over to some other place and composting that, and then in the process of composting, particularly, I mean, the most common way that is thermophilic composting.
Mm-hmm.
In that process, you lose, depending on the temperatures and so forth, for sure 50% of the carbon goes into carbon dioxide,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the nitrogen is going to be lost because, uh, you know, uh, generating ammonia and stuff like that, but
Mm-hmm.
also just because of the uh, nitrogen use in the decomposition process. And so then you, after all that work and losing all those nutrients and carbon, you take that back and try to distribute it across the field. Well, you have no idea whether the nutrient was coming out in that particular crop is making it back where it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have a system where you take the biomass that came out of a bed right here and you compost it right here, and that composting process can occur without interfering with the rhizosphere, uh, within 2 feet of where the biomass actually grew, the likelihood of getting pretty much 90% of the nutrients that came out back exactly to the same soil where it came from, pretty high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's the research that we've been doing is, first of all, in looking at it, just from the process of, okay, is there any way that you can organize, the spheres, in a way that works from, just a rational way.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you go back and you look at agricultural practices, ancient agricultural practices, we have very, very little information about them. We have what soils they left behind, like Terra Prieta,
Mm-hmm.
or the Plagan soils of Europe,
Mm-hmm.
some of the richest soils in the world, all created by human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we know that people have actually accomplished this in the past. And right after the last ice age, basically you had all of the land masses had all of the soil scraped and then washed off of the continental surfaces.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people like emerged from the caves, after the ice was gone, they were left with very, very poor soils in a lot of cases. And it's clear that in many places, people figured out or learned from their environment uh, how soil actually, forms, and they were able to take those lessons that they could see around them. And they had elders that could, hand observations on, so you could accumulate, a worthwhile
Mm-hmm.
amount of information, trial and error. Um, and even out here, taking these inklings of like what they would do and trialing them, you can put that together.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been able to come up with a system that, particularly if you look at the air photos of the Terra Prieta region and think about what they were actually doing, they were in these swamplands. They needed to build arable land up out of the swamplands. There wasn't any place where they could get soil and do that fill, but they were in the tropics, so they could grow a huge volume of mass
Mm-hmm.
and then fill in the swamps exactly the way the coal forming swamps were occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And what did they end up with? Black soil,
Yep.
just exactly like a coal swamp.
Mm-hmm.
Now, undoubtedly, they would, if they had spare charcoal around, I'm sure that they put that in there too. But it's also very clear that under the right management, that you can get all of the spheres of the soil biology to begin working together, and then you supply that critical piece. That critical piece is making sure that all the above ground material that you've generated makes it into the soil close by, and that it decomposes in a way that virtually everything that you put down there goes into the soil. And if you cover it with wood chips and let the fungal hyphae go and create an occlusive seal over that, you've excluded the air. If you're doing it in a trench where you're completely excluding the soil. The only thing in that trench is biomass that you put there. And then you make that large enough that you can handle the amount of biomass that you're putting in. So you may be putting in biomass that you're harvesting from the whole area around you, surplus biomass, and putting it into a form that'll make it into a trench. So you would have to have a deeper trench to do that. But all that means is that the more mass, conservation of mass goes in, it's got to go someplace. And in that case, what it does, it turns into soil. And that's how you grow out a terra prieta, just by harvesting biomass, feeding it to the right critters, making sure that the atmosphere, the soils, and the water can't get to it, and you end up with black soil that's, I don't know, 30, 40% carbon.
So,
perfectly natural biological system.
Absolutely, I agree.
Mimics nature.
So
Spend 500 years watching nature, you're liable to arrive at it.
fantastic. Do you want to maybe explain the trenches that you have here at the farm and
Would you want to look at pictures of them or what?
well, maybe if you want to just first give like a basic rundown what you're doing, what you're growing, what you're filling the trenches with,
Sure.
and just a little 5-minute blurb on
Okay.
that.
Well, basically, we have our garden systems worked out with a 4-foot wide growing space, just a regular vegetable growing bed. And then we have an 18-inch wide walkway that's actually a 2-foot deep trench. And so, in order to get this system started, you have to do a little setup. If you let carbon accumulate on the bottom of a soil trench, it's in contact with soil, and the soil will decompose the organic matter. And so if you go and you grow a crop that is extremely high in lignin and stuff that has a very, very hard time breaking down to begin with, and you line, say, start out with a foot deep layer of this material, when it decomposes, it'll end up a 1-inch layer.
Okay.
But so what we do is that when we first dig our trenches, we grow a crop of either sunflowers, just because they're sticky, they're full of resins, they're full of lignin and that sort of thing, stuff that'll really stay around. And so we fill the entire 2 feet with the bottom with sunflower stalks, big round stalks, and then a layer of leaves, and then a layer of the sunflowers themselves. And then we cover that with wood chips, and then we take weed barrier. We have 6-foot wide strips of weed barrier, which we fold up to where they're just 18 inches wide. We fold them in quarters and set it over there. So now you have a situation that's dark, cool, full of wood chips, and full of biomass of all different kinds, all the crop of the sunflowers. And so what you then have is exactly the same system of soil conditions as you would have in an old growth forest. You have 2 feet deep layer of biomass in the dark, in the cool. Now that material, that 2-foot layer, particularly the foot that's full of sunflower, the flowers and the leaves, they'll be gone in 2 weeks. I mean, it's gone.
Yep.
So that means the walkway drops 6-8 inches like from the get-go. And so, and then you're using this walkway to walk on, so it's working all that material down to the bottom of the trench. Well, you're doing 2 things. First of all, you're kicking off all the biology in the walls of the trench. That biology is shoulder-to-shoulder worms, earthworms. Now, you don't have to inoculate. You put the food there, they will show up, unless you just have it.
They sniff out the decomposition.
Oh, absolutely. And then they breed like crazy. And before long, all the walls are full of the worms and all of the ancillary critters that are part of the drillosphere, and there are hundreds of different species in that. And then, so you have to be ready with a next batch of biomass to put into the trench that has now dropped off, because if you expose the walls of it, you kill the worms. And so you want to come in there. So what we do is as soon as we got the trench dug and we've taken all the soil from the trench and we've put it on the beds on either side of it, and we immediately plant it in something like buckwheat. It grows incredibly fast. It's incredibly luscious. If you catch it at first flower, it will. If you put it in a trench, it'll decompose in 2 weeks. And so for the first year, you may be just growing material to you put into the trench just to get it good and going. The other thing you can do is be growing cover crops to fill trenches in one bed, and then growing your vegetable crop in the bed instead.
Yep.
But you have to have something to continue to feed the trenches.
It's almost to make a simple assimilation for people, like it's almost like feeding a sourdough. Obviously different, but yeah, it's a living organism in itself. More of a community, but yeah,
it is.
Yep.
Okay, so one of the things that's really critical to what we're doing is we are planting hedgerows of willow. Okay. Very, very fast-growing willow. Poplar would work too, but it's a little harder to control. And we have a very specific willow. This is a willow that does not produce by rhizomes. It doesn't spread. There's lots of willows, and some of them are really bad boys. But you get the right ones. They grow really, really fast. They're very well behaved. And so all you do is you let them grow out into ramial wood, nice, soft, first-year wood, tons of it. You chip it up, and that's what you feed the trenches.
All right. Yep.
Because what it does is it's both, ramial wood is really, really high in lignin and suberin and stuff like that in the first place. It decomposes much more quickly than second-year wood or cellulose ridden wood. So it provides both the goodies and the sugars and all that stuff that the critters in the detritosphere want, and it also liberates lots and lots of long-term carbon molecules, the lignins and stuff.
Yep.
Okay, so we're growing out hedgerows of material just to feed the trenches in our garden, because you have to keep the result of taking all this mass, conservation of mass goes in, mass has to come out. Well, it turns into soil. Every single one of our beds increases in depth of soil 2 inches every year. And with that, you have a couple of things. You either get deeper and deeper trenches, which means you have to grow more biomass, or you very gently harvest the soil and move it to a new bed. So rather than having to dig a trench 2 feet deep, you dig a trench 1 foot deep and move the soil that you grew last year for the other foot.
And do you want to let people know what that soil consists of?
It is almost entirely fecal pellets. We call it worm cheese. And so pretty much every single aggregate that you've seen there has either been through the mouth parts of a critter being licked off and then discarded, or ingested through a gut and come out as a fecal pellet, like worm castings.
So you're growing amendments.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the organic content of these soils, it comes out of the ecology at like 5% organic matter.
And I want to and highlight, if people haven't already realized, Scott isn't bringing inputs into the farm.
None. You don't need to.
Yeah, no, he is creating this here.
Yeah.
So.
No. As a matter of fact, as far as volume and mass, the biggest product of what we're doing on our farm, and we're growing lots and lots of vegetables too, but I would say the most important, and by volume the largest amount, is soil.
Absolutely.
We're growing soil, and in the bottom of the trenches, we're growing lignite at a noticeable rate.
Instead of blowing up mountains for it.
Right. And so if one model, if instead of being involved in food production agriculture or fiber production agriculture, once we mature enough to understand how to use land management and soil biology to sequester carbon, and I've looked at grinding up serpentine and then roasting it, or drilling down into serpentine and pumping the waste gases from a power plant, or all of the other carbon capture ideas. If you look at the infrastructure and machinery that it takes in order to produce just the object itself, the carbon footprint of it is so much larger than what the device itself could possibly capture. It's a boondoggle. And I have looked at, carefully from an engineering and chemistry perspective of everything that's been proposed out there. And, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. It does not pan out once you look at it. This, you're not doing anything but growing stuff and feeding it to a biological system that has successfully done exactly the process we're looking at for 1.5 billion years. We have coal deposits, from the Cambrian.
So,
you know,
to also kind of help put in perspective for people, the processes that are happening in the trench are something, that would take hundreds of thousands or millions of years typically, and
there are peat bogs that, because of their nature, the fact that they dry out on a seasonal basis, they may be wet for a decade, and then it goes into a dry spell and they dry out. The lignite formation begins as soon as the water goes away, as long as the land is not disturbed, and that process, even in nature, can occur in a matter of years, and certainly not eons.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that we really dial it in and make sure that all the right critters are there and that we got all our quorum sensing. it takes about a year for this to really get cranking, for you to really see, for you to clearly see 2 inches of soil formed every year. The first year it's going to be a little not that. Well, of course, if you get it completely dialed in, come and we'll show you how to do it. And come out 2 inches a year to begin with. But anyway, by optimizing, by really understanding the nature of all of the different biological and chemical systems, you can make it happen, the entire process happen in 3 months easily, so that all of the nutrients that were in that biomass are in the rhizosphere, ready to go in 3 months.
So I've heard you describe the trenches and how the carbon comes into the beds and the soil. You describe it as a pump.
It is.
Yeah. So you want to describe that description a little bit?
There are a couple of things that are happening in this pumping. One is you're pumping nutrients out of biomass and into soil. Well, one of the interesting things about the decomposition of these products, first of all, most biomass, if you cut it when it's wet and put it in the soil, is 60% moisture to begin with. And so that moisture is already underground, and just because of osmotic pressure, if the soils in the growing bed are drawing moisture for plant growth, there's going to be a gradient, and so the moisture that's coming out of the decomposition is being pulled into the rhizosphere. So it's irrigating. The decomposition of the material is irrigating, literally. The other part of it is that if you think about the word carbohydrate, well, hydrate means there's water in there. Okay, so if you decompose these systems with the right biology, what happens is when the carbons, when the hydroxyl groups and the methyl groups, or the hydrogen and the oxygen, when they decompose under the right circumstances, they will join to form brand new water composed of hydrogens and oxygens that were not ever together before, and they form water. This is called juvenile water. And so in the system, the carbon decomposes from the carbohydrates. The carbon goes and turns into, lignite, and the hydrates that were in there form brand new water and go into the system.
Mm-hmm.
So this process is actually creating brand new water in addition to that. So in a sense, it's pumping hydrogen and oxygen atoms out of biomass, turning them into the water and pumping that into the soil. Brand new water.
And what comes out are these fecal pellets and worm castings.
Right.
That's your pump.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And so the reason I bring that up is because what's important to remember about these methodologies is they're when you run into a lot of the methods that people in permaculture and regenerative agriculture are trying to implement these days, it's not that they're inherently bad, it's that they're inefficient to deal with the issue that we're facing right now.
Well, and most of them, I have to say, are swimming upstream.
Mm-hmm.
They have an idea of what they want to accomplish, regardless of what the natural processes are between them and their goal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's when you really have a deep understanding of, I mean, not down to the nuclear chemistry of something, but just these critters do that, and all this stuff is observable stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need. I mean, it's fun to have a microscope
Mm-hmm.
and to name everybody and see where they are and what they do and all that stuff. But you certainly don't need that to see the processes we're talking about. They're more than visible to the naked eye. And they were visible to the indigenous people that figured them out 8,000 years ago and created terra preta and pagan soils.
And I think to piggyback on that too, it's hard for a single human or even a group of humans to approximate what the soil may need in a specific location as opposed to another part of your location.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to just bring a soil particle and put it under the microscope, it's not going to tell you what's going on even at the end of your bed.
No.
So
Exactly.
it's just a slice of the community.
Right.
So
yeah, everything exists in continuums. Everything is fractal.
Mm-hmm.
And you may be able to understand the overall character of it, and that guides you to be able to look at microcosms of it or macrocosms of it. But it's when you see that it's a continuum, and the tiniest little change can change the whole system. Absolutely. The amount of moisture in it, that sort of thing.
So understanding that, could you maybe speak to humans' roles in either caretaking or stewarding the land as opposed to maybe trying to impose our will on it?
Yeah. Well, anyone who talks about indigenous perspective and natural law will say the very, very first step is observation and reverence. If you approach it with observation and reverence, with the understanding that there is definitely more there going on than you understand, and you tread lightly, and if you have elders or guides or training that can begin to, set you up, okay, we'll try these steps and then watch carefully what you see. They're not telling you, do this, like an instruction. All they're doing is telling you where to find your sit point and how long you might need to wait. Mm-hmm. And to set the process up, in a way that nothing you're doing, you don't get any Heisenberg effects where you're, making an unintended change in the system just by the way or where you're sitting.
Exploding soils.
But, winding copper wire and put it on sticks. And
that'll be in the next episode.
Right. Be careful of that. Particularly then in mass coronal ejections, because you could, if you're touching it, it depends on how big it is. But that's really what it comes down to, is having the patience to gain as much understanding about what's going on in the system as you can. And then from that perspective, if you feel or you've been led by a teacher or something to say, okay, like my grandmother, go out and do this, and because we're going to be planting this crop in here, and um, what that was telling me to do was, okay, you're going to learn something brand new that you don't know anything about yet, and this is the first step. And because if you're raised with uh, you know being inquisitive and disciplined in the sense that you just don't go out and decide to do something and see what happens, then you'll be guided to maturity and understanding these processes. The system was not set up to confuse or hide anything. I mean, that's the one thing that I love about real regenerative farming, is that it is such a delight every single day to have your point of view modified by what you learn that day. And you may have grown a crop for years, and this year it's cool in the spring and it does a different thing. So just because you've been incredibly successful in years past with a given crop probably means you'll have to learn something new this year in order to be equally successful.
I think that that resistance to learning is probably why people choose to till in the first place, to sanitize, you know, which ultimately is going to leave them behind. I think as fast as this technological world moves, I think humans are not recognizing how much further biology already is.
Yeah. Well, another issue that, okay, you had the Green Revolution, and these chemists believed that they had the hubris to believe that now we understand how wheat works. We can even like breed wheat, we can even genetically alter wheat, and we have all these chemicals. We are so on top of it, and we're going to talk everybody in the world, as a matter of fact, militarily force them to grow this stuff because we're right. And they discover that there were so many unintended circumstances to what they said, and they may have been driven by other agendas, but the point is that it was catastrophic. It was absolutely catastrophic. I mean, suicides all over the world from people that had destroyed their land, their soils, were so in debt because of the idea of commodity, where you go into debt, you produce something on the hopes that it's worth so much that it's not only going to pay off the debt but lift you into prosperity, which has never happened. It hasn't happened under the best, I mean, the biggest machinery in the world.
The Bernie Madoff effect.
Pretty much. And so we unfortunately are seeing that very same hubris show up in even the most, what do I say, innovative, or even in regenerative agriculture.
Absolutely.
You can go to online seminars or meetings or stuff like that where people are selling commodities, amendments usually, and services, and that's the underpinning of really what's their perspective on things. This is the same problem that the Green Revolution brought up, and when you jump into paradigms like that and don't pay attention to the unintended circumstances, that because you jumped so fast from your research to your corporation that you didn't let enough time go by to even understand whether or not you had the quorum sensing worked out on your experiment, let alone how it fits into the spectrum of habitats and crops and climates that are out there. So the thing about what we're doing is we don't have any amendments. We don't have any services. All we do is observe what is going on biologically year to year, and with reading lots and lots of research papers on how this critter does and how that critter does and stuff, you can get enough pieces there to at least guide your eyes to good observation points.
Mm-hmm.
And then through that, everything we do is I mean, every time I try another idea, the first thing I go to is, okay, how does nature do this thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or, okay, in nature, when you change this parameter, think of a place where in nature it's doing it one way, and then another place in nature it's doing this other way, and what are the differences in them? So you always have a context of what natural process are you emulating or patterning,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. And if you can't find that pattern in nature someplace, highly unadvised to do it.
I agree.
And we've been able to be incredibly successful just by observation and copying stuff that happens around us.
Absolutely. I'd extend that notion to every part of life, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Well, honestly, it's the difference between indigenous, and I don't mean that in the sense of native peoples on their native lands. Indigenosity is a perspective. It's a relationship between an individual and the metaphysics of the universe, if you
Mm-hmm.
want, but certainly a relationship between an individual and the natural environment, or the environment
Mm-hmm.
that they live in. That relationship. Where does your food come from? What are you materially leaving behind?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Excellent. How are we doing on time? Oh.
he's been signaling you the entire time with that.
All right. How about
Lead into a quick break.
yeah. We are going to take a intermission and cover some more topics. Oh, thank God. How you doing? This is RJ. We're back from the break, and going into part 2 with Scott Goode.
Mm-hmm.
Where we left off was, I believe, indigenosity.
Well, it's about what relationship do you need to embrace to really engage in something that's regenerative, and that is something that is as attentive and respectful and to always approach, like I said, to be able to. I'm sorry. Can we?
Oh, no, that's good. You want to just start over again?
I mean, you can.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the thing is,
Yeah,
okay.
okay.
When I saw
I know.
him typing,
I should have brought it over here and started.
I had no. The problem is, because one of the parts of my dyslexia is when I jump to try to resolve text, it suddenly takes absolutely all of my concentration
Mm-hmm.
to even focus there, that everything else I'll just lose it, and it's when I see text moving on. Anyway, that's what just happened there. Anyway,
We need a thing, how they distract a kid at the doctors with another thing over the shoulder or something.
Yeah. Anyway, I apologize, but
No,
this exact thing happened. I was doing a presentation, it's recorded on OSU, and it had the caption thing, where it spells out on the screen what's being said.
Yeah. You were looping yourself.
I couldn't even.
They're like, read the teleprompter, and he's like,
you
Just
know,
reading the same line over.
I just went, deer in the headlights, Anyway.
Yeah,
No, that's
I mean,
okay.
That's fine. Like none of this part is streamed, so we can edit it.
No, I
Nah,
understand that.
These will
That's why I'm not
be
terrified
bloopers
of
we
it.
throw in.
Yeah.
Strategically.
Yeah, we need to save those up.
How much time does it say we have on the memory card?
Well, since I think we're recording directly,
Oh.
yeah.
Oh,
it's not-
sweet. Great.
So as far as
Not an
audio,
issue.
it says we have 53 hours left.
Oh, I think that's enough.
With this audio,
Yeah.
and then
Right.
there's nothing for. I mean, we're at 17% CPU after like an hour and a half. On
Okay.
audio and video, so I would say you probably have another 2 to 3 hours of video.
Great. Cool. Cool. Let's just.
Is it possible to play back what we just recorded?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I have to stop.
Yeah. Go just
Recording.
stop. Yeah. Stop recording.
Do you
And we're back from the break. We're here with Scott Goode as we were before, and we're just picking off where we left off with talking about indigenosity. So if you want to take the wheel, Scott.
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, what it's about is what relationship do you need to embrace and to really, genuinely be regenerative, in the sense that first of all, you understand enough of the ways that land works, and that's what the craft of farming has been about for thousands of years. And I got to grow up on a farm with a grandfather that understood the land so well. He it was just in his blood what happened next. In a year, and to be around that for a while, and to be able to pick up those rhythms, that is the skill that you need in order to really be a good manager of the land, regardless of whether you're a farmer or a grazer or what it is, forester even. And what the characteristic that certainly has in any of the people that I've seen do that as a craft is their capacity to observe. And they're attentive. They understand even the smallest changes in what goes on from season to season, for instance. And when I go out on the land with folks in Butte Falls, they talk about, wow, this year was, they're that attentive to the little details, and what flower that made come out first or something like that.
Yep.
And that they're, respectful of that, because it keeps them like in tune with, where they are and what's up, and if something is getting out of line, early on. And that, keeps them observant not only of the things on their land, but their relationships. That's something that, when they talk about social permaculture, the spin-off of being respectful and attentive and observant, in your relationships is, I think, what that's talking about.
I'd agree.
Yeah.
It's I actually had someone ask me recently, do microbes in the soil, or just, I think they just refer to it as life in the soil, do they make decisions? Do they consider what their fellow microbes think, or how they might be able to lift up more than just themselves, but their whole community?
Well, your spleen does that.
Yeah.
I mean, just for example, how many other, particularly endocrine, they're all talking to each other.
No, I agree. It's
and the soil, in a sense, if you look at an entire sphere, you could sort of think of that as an individual. It has this one, life that it does,
I
and a
agree.
task that it does. It takes it creates takes detritus and feeds it to somebody.
I
So
you know
that's the way I think of it is that all the interactions that are going on there, and then you have these interactions between the spheres
hmm
that are almost like intersocial interactions.
I've noticed different locations or different gardens can have certain
Oh
personalities.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How they like
Attitudes on
yeah,
occasion.
attitudes.
Okay, you're gonna treat me like that?
How
Good
far
luck with the beans, there, buddy.
Yeah, yeah, you need to listen to your soil. I think that's listen to it, observe it, never force it to do anything. Um, but yeah.
Yeah.
um,
Well, I once again, I just look at it, as a reflection of social interactions. If you're, graceful and thoughtful and observant, then the culture you generate and the friends you have and so forth are, going to be, more constructive. And on the other hand, you're, you know, living a life of violence, you're going to end up with, wastelands. It's the
absolutely.
same thing. It's exactly the same thing with soil. If you're going out there with blades slicing through the landscape in order to make it look the way your agriculture teacher told you it was supposed to look like,
hmm
you know.
I mean, I think it
Well,
gets
actually, what
at
it is the tillage manufacturers tell you, and they have since the industry began.
oh yeah, no, I mean you have to create a problem to fix it.
Exactly. Well, and that's what the um, um, interfere and amend, idea of agriculture is about.
hmm
It,
hmm
you disturb and amend, and you disturb and amend, and originally, the guy that really started that nonsense was Jethro Tull in
hmm
England, and
not the musician.
well, it, there is not a musician. There's a band named Jethro Tull, made up of Ian Anderson and some others. But anyway, they were referencing this guy because he had this, and some others had this theory that in order to get the nutrition out of the soil, you had to grind it into finer and finer pieces, and that the finer the soil was, the more surface area it had, and therefore it was more available to the roots.
hmm
So, I mean, in a very simple mindset, you can see there are some physics that might suggest that. It's wrong, but
hmm
anyway. Um, but what he was, that was his sort of scientific justification. But what he was really interested in was, up until that time, uh, the fact that it took people in order to produce food gave those people a modicum of power. In that, if anything bad happened to them, the people that might do that bad thing would starve.
hmm hmm
Modicum of power there.
hmm
And then if you get really uppity and you have like labor unions and farm labor and stuff like that, you know, even goes into the realm of politics and things like that. And then
hmm
the next thing you know, you got two parliaments, labor. It's crazy, man. Anyway, um, so when Jethro Tull and some others realized that they could build a machine that it only took one person to replace the entire harvest crew, for instance, or tillers, people that went out and planted the
hmm
crop, behind a livestock pulling a plow of some kind.
hmm
So uh, when they realized that they could, one guy they could keep under the thumb pretty effectively
hmm
because he, was pretty much powerless. They could find another guy
Yep.
pretty
Yep.
quick. And so, really, what was behind um, the development of mechanical agriculture was to remove, farmers themselves from the equation.
hmm
Uh, And then you end up with migrant farmers and that sort of thing. You know?
Yep.
And then you put on top of it the fact that the capital costs, and in most of the places in the world, that means credit, debt that you have to incur in order to have the only story in town, the only thing you're ever taught, the only thing you see in the stores, the only story in town, and that that keeps, and you can particularly ask the people that are spending $500,000 on a machine that you have to have a factory trained technician to you know, and then it's proprietary software that they're loading and you can't even
Yeah.
and necessarily because it's too complicated and you don't want a farmer out there twiddling with the knobs. I can understand that, but anyway, but the whole ramifications of the expense and the layers and upon layers of uncertainty that there are in that, and the supply chains that are involved in it. Well, that is the inevitable outcome of this misguided idea that mechanical agriculture was a good idea. And the thing about it is replacing expensive machinery and the the capital investment, the interests, and the fuels, and all the things that, well, you could pay 5 people a living wage and accomplish absolutely everything that any of that machinery. I don't get BCS walk behind any of them, and I can take you outside and show you that you can accomplish all that. A 71-year-old man with like 4 implements can accomplish it,
I agree.
And people did for thousands and thousands of years before this misguided, step into mechanical agriculture.
So to kind of put things in context, to put simply, you're doing petroleum-free agriculture.
Right. Well, here are the key things. A supply chain that is provided by a local smithy with a 3D printer that you can take a broken knob down there made out of some cheap plastic, and they can machine you a nice one out of aluminum for less than the postage it would take in order to ship it to you, for instance. And that is when you want something, you just go down, and in the high schools in their vocational education are teaching kids how to use their 3D printers to fix anything.
Yeah, so people are...
That's the first thing, making the supply chain local. The second is to completely remove petroleum from the equation for like 6 reasons. Political reasons, like, wars and all that nonsense, for climate reasons. It's a toxin that ends up getting all over everything when you use it in agriculture.
Yeah.
Along with the hydraulic fluid, and that is being sprayed all over your food. I mean, just look at hydraulics on most of on machinery. Look at the drip lines underneath the barns and everything where they are. So you completely eliminate that toxin in your food chain, and having to clean up a farm after it's no longer a farm, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's what is the carbon footprint of the device. How much carbon did it take to make the tires, the rims, the stems, the bearings, machining them all down, transporting them to factory, assembling them, transporting to the showroom before you ever even put any gas in it? What is the carbon footprint of just owning that? And if you're going to be regenerative, then the activity you're doing should responsibly address all of the ancillary costs of you doing that. And so basically what it comes down to, if you can afford, a tractor or petroleum-based anything really, then I think if you're going to be honest about being regenerative, be sustainable, and then see environmentally responsible as a citizen of the planet right now, then you have to honestly accept, you know, all of the circumstances of what you're doing. And if there's a way of doing that without those circumstances, and first of all you have to do is history. I mean, they built entire empires, you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the fortunate thing is we don't have to have slaves. We could actually understand how the biology works.
Absolutely. We
You know?
become symbiotes.
Right. And if you look anywhere else, you know, leading first of all, you know, from all the stages that fungi has, you know, accomplished through every single time, you know, the earth gets splattered, fungi figures out a way to, you know, digest what was there before and turn it into, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the next stage.
Absolutely.
And then something that hides underneath the ground along with the fungus, whatever that is, mammal or, you know, whatever, proto-reptiles and, you know, at the end of the Permian, whatever, you know. Somebody will crawl out from underneath along with the fungi, and, you know, the fungi will digest all the nonsense that's around them. They eat the fungi, and then as soon as other stuff is there to eat, then they get to eat that too. But, you know, that's a cycle that, you know, has gone on over and over and over again. And we're in no different a situation. But you have to return back to where what's real. I mean, you have to have known enough to hide in the earth during the transformation. You know, and that's where understanding where literally your roots are. And for us, it's growing food. It's growing food in a way that'll make it through, you know, whatever, and is as good an idea now as it has ever been. And it allows you a place, if you want to step away from petroleum and factory farming and, you know, a lot of other things that I think are frankly dangerous in the world, you have to have a place to step back into. That place has to be people that are equipped and skilled in being able to, you know, feed a community and throw a party. You know?
Absolutely.
They have to be able to do that. If you spend all your life in slavery, or, you know, just working, you know, that's not a civilization. That's a tyranny of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of being able to have that space for, you know, celebration and, you know, life sequence celebrations and music and all good food, all the things that identify you as a culture. You have to balance, you know, the rigors of good agriculture with the joys of a, you know, salubrious community.
Is the affirmation of life.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at any indigenous community in the world, they will have great foods, great celebrations, connectedness to, you know, the annual cycles, knowing where they are, you know, through the year, through their lives. They're moving from that. There's a clear path from childhood to elderhood, and that every single, you know, part of both the salubrious community and the farm, that there's a place for everybody.
It's it gets at the true definition, I think, of like to cultivate.
Yeah, that's a real culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, I think that is a pretty gosh darn good first episode.
Yeah. Huh?
Yeah, and we will have a lot more to explore here in the future. You guys will definitely see a lot more of Scott, and we can't wait to see you guys next time. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jesse. Great job. Great job.
Awesome. That was great. That was a good one. Good way.